You're listening to Start Writing, where we explore the great minds behind the greatest stories. Hosted by Joseph Bendosky, author of the Skyfalls series, and Jay Washburn, author of the Star Child space opera. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Start Writing podcast. Our guest today is B.C. Walker. He has had a successful career in business. He's also a 2D artist, and he made a successful foray into the world of writing novels. This mixture of those three careers is why I wanted to share his story with you today. We understand that many of you listeners are working traditional full-time jobs while you moonlight as authors. And I can't count the number of people who've said to me, I've always wanted to write a novel. And B.C. Walker did it. He made it happen. And in this episode, I ask him how. He's an example of how you can make this a viable path to your writing goals. We recorded this a couple of months ago, and this interview was almost an epiphany for me. It struck me how much fun it is to read a book and then ask the author questions about writing it. And honestly, I had a blast. I love doing this podcast. And so this is an awesome supplement for anyone who has read Brett's novel. Now, two final notes before we begin. First, our audio is a little scratchy, and you have my apologies for that. Second, I want you to hear the bird song of a western meadowlark, which you'll find relevant as the episode goes. So here that is. So I like to start by asking people about their name, and you used B.C. Walker, so you did your initials on your book. Tell me about that decision.
Good question. I went with B.C. Walker in a way to neutralize the fact that I'm a male writer, and in part because it seems like the market over the last couple of decades has shifted to mostly female readers, especially of fiction and more historical fiction. The demographics don't necessarily tell the full story, but it seems to be that men are reading more nonfiction. Everyone is, but also not as much fiction. So I wanted to be at a level sort of neutral in that space. Yeah. So at first glance, people might not blow it off and say, when I look at what Amazon, how it's presenting my book, it's surrounded by female writers. And so, it seems like it was a good call at the time. And secondly, so it wasn't really to obfuscate my name or have a true pen name, but it was just to kind of move into a space also where it was a little bit separated from my professional life. Oh. It's a fun side hustle, but it wasn't one that I needed to draw a lot of attention to. In that way, my clients want me to seem and act focused, right? And so that was part of some of my thinking was around that.
Yeah. So I want to ask you about your book and your creativity, but I kind of want to set that up by asking about your career. So tell us about, maybe start with your degree and just give us some of the milestones along the way of your career.
Okay. My undergraduate was liberal arts, American studies and political science, and I wrote a fair amount there. And that's actually when I got my first taste of publishing with a historical piece that I did on, Sears used to make these kit homes called honor built homes. They'd ship all of the parts to a rail side anywhere in the United States, and you basically could assemble the home using the instructions they gave you.
It's
You know,
crazy.
the wood was all pre-cut, the holes were all pre-drilled. You built the home
Huh.
maybe like an erector set. And so it was a fun discovery. I got published as a student publication my senior year at Brigham Young University, and kind of started I started liking the idea of writing more and publishing more about then.
Hmm.
Um,
Wait, so I'm not sure I connected the kit homes to the writing.
that was the subject of my research and what I wrote about. Sorry,
Uh-huh.
I didn't make that clear. So
Huh.
it was kind of an obscure thing that one of my professors pointed me to. I went and did the research, wrote an article. It was well received. It was kind of very novel.
Hmm.
You know, it was sort of it seemed a bit out of the ordinary for a historical perspective on how you would have built a home. Um, but I then subsequently, because I speak Mandarin Chinese, I served an LDS
Oh.
mission to Taiwan. My first job was with a tech company in Southern California. There was a CAD software company, and I was hired there because of the language, and kind of started into marketing at that point, doing marketing in Asia. I came back to this area with my second job as a tech writer with another tech company, a company at the time called Folio, that was doing full index search capabilities on massive amounts of text, and sort of new technology then. Sounds very common now, but then it was very uncommon to be able to
Hmm.
do that. Subsequently went to graduate school and got a master's in organizational behavior. Along the way, consulted with a few tech companies, and continued kind of loving that category. Interestingly, when I went out to I wanted to be a consultant and work on organizational change and culture and other things out of graduate school. Everyone I interviewed with saw my tech background, my marketing background, and said, "Hey, could you help us productize what we're doing?" And I got offers down that path, but no offers down my dream path at the time.
Hmm.
Um, and those offers weren't as compelling as some of the offers in tech. So I went back into tech, found my way very quickly to Intel Corporation in
Oh,
the
cool.
early 90s, worked there through the 90s in product marketing and brand management, did some fun things there,
Dang.
helped really see a part of the company grow. Subsequently left Intel and went to Ancestry.com, which kind of started speaking to some of my interest in historical fiction. At Ancestry, and then a few other .coms, had experience there in marketing as head of marketing, and then made a jump back into professional services a couple of times as head of marketing for companies that I had wanted to work with, and now they were ready to grow, and I was ready to help them with their products. Right, I was ready to be that guy. We grew a couple of companies where they had authors in the companies wanting to write books and bestsellers. So I actually did marketing for 4 different New York Times bestsellers.
Wow.
Got those to #1 status at a couple of different companies,
And
and saw
those were all
that path.
nonfiction?
Yeah, they were all nonfiction.
Hmm.
Saw that path. It was fun. And along the way, I dabbled in, I didn't have a lot of time to do long format stuff. And so I wrote kind of personal narrative essays based on some profound things that had happened in my life. Kind of life and death are both really profound, for me at least. I think for many people they are. But one was my grandfather dying, and he had taught me from when I was a young boy to play the harmonica. And so I wrote this essay about kind of that in parallel to
Oh,
his
cool.
winding down in life, and won an award with that in an essay contest, won that contest. And then a couple of years later, my wife went through a liver transplant. Her slow decline into really poor health and then rapid recovery after that also inspired another piece that I wrote. It also won an award. So there was a little bit of feedback coming my way that said, hey, maybe you could do this. So that's kind of what brought me, and then I've been consulting and working across this space. I've written tons of content, articles, ghostwritten content, mostly nonfiction business content over my career. Those are my kind of my forays into the world of semi-fiction. It wasn't truly fiction, but more dramatic.
Yeah.
narrative with dialogue and other things. It was fun to see that side of things.
So yeah, you've mentioned the technical writing and then creative nonfiction. Did you have the germ of an idea to write a novel when you were young, or was this just like a recent thing, or how did you then make that leap to writing a novel?
Good question. So I lived in a small town, grew up in a small town, Rigby, Idaho. I lived there till I was 13, and so I left Idaho at a young age. It sort of sealed it in kind of a time capsule in my mind. I've been back many times, but you don't go back the same way that you leave. And so it just sat there as a set of fond memories for me through much of my life, my adult life. But when I met my wife, about that time, I began working on a novel because I thought I wanted to try it. So I'd written some short stories, kind of kept them all to myself during college, dabbled in poetry. I'm not much of a poet. I don't really know what comprises good poetry, but there may be people out there who do, but tried it, right? But I always had this sort of germ of an idea that I was going to write a story about Idaho. I called it my Idaho book, referred to it frequently. My dad, when I had lived in Rigby, Idaho, had owned a restaurant, was a restaurant manager and owner. And so every bit of thinking I ever applied to this idea always had the story set in a restaurant. But I never had a story. Like it wasn't enough of a place to have enough of a story. At least in my mind. Of course, you could write a long story about, people standing in the exact same spot the entire time, and it could be fascinating. But for me, it wasn't really. It didn't have legs enough to take me to the place of actually writing. Do you want me to tell you how it moved from that idea into, me writing, or I don't want to jump ahead of your question.
Well. Yeah, let's do that right now. I do have two more intro questions, but just continue on this line of thought for a sec.
Okay. So what happened, again, I'd done a fair amount of family history work. I was always fascinated by that. I published a family history on my 12th great grandfather who came to the U.S. At the time, the American colonies, or even before that, 1630, on the Winthrop fleet from England. And kind of retraced my steps. Part of it came from me wondering how my family got to Idaho. I didn't really fully answer that question at the time, but I found myself back many generations before with my family coming to America. And that was interesting. But my aging mother, my father passed. We buried him near this little town in Idaho. My mother was aging and ailing. We took her back to Idaho on a couple of Memorial Day weekends and visited graves. And we went to 4 different cemeteries, some of which I'd never visited before. Memorial Day was always kind of a weird event to me. They're going out putting flowers on graves, but as you get older, you begin to appreciate things differently. So we went out, and I kind of started looking at these people, wondering at the names on headstones, thinking, there are stories here. What are they? And doing a little more research into these more recent individuals. And then as we drove, there was a network of canals all over that valley of southeastern Idaho, the Upper Snake River Valley. And one called the dry bed, that its name is a massive oxymoron because it was never dry in my recollection from my younger years including the times I've been back. So I just sort of sourced them all. I went upstream on Google Maps to say, where do they come from? And they all originated at this one break in the Snake River, on the South Fork of the Snake River, that I feature in my book. Never heard of that. It was called the Great Feeder. So these were things that, they piqued my interest as I began digging into them. This Idaho book sort of came alive. I went from a pretty tight locale in my prior thinking of a restaurant to a much bigger area, which allowed the story to really have legs and begin to speak to me.
Man, that's super cool. So I wondered whether that was real as I was reading, and I didn't Google it. I thought, well, I'll just ask. But and I mean, is Willow Creek a real place, or was that a fictionalization?
Yes and yes. Yeah, Willow Creek at one point was a real town at a location. There is a Willow Creek that flows 50 miles north. It starts south in almost in Utah, flows due north, and then flows into what is now called Ryrie Reservoir
Mm,
before it turns and comes back toward Idaho Falls. There was a town site at one point along that creek, but that creek has long since been straightened out, turned into the canals, and
mm.
on and on. Once it leaves the hills, it's just a ditch. But so I also had this memory of a town. Again, I'll say Rigby,
Mm.
but it's changed so dramatically. But I wanted to remember it, create a town or have a town that fit my memories as a young man. And so I ended up fictionalizing it, picking the name Willow Creek, which no longer exists, um, and putting it in a slightly different location just because, and then bringing the best of all of my own little small town experience together
Mm.
into my fictional Willow Creek.
Dang, that's so cool. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to ask you a few more things about that, but let me just pop back. I got an insider tip that I should ask you about your recent cowboy activities in central Utah.
Yeah, good tip. That's been a fun experience. It's interesting because I have a brother-in-law who, when he was young, his father was a farrier, meaning a guy that put shoes on horses, and
Mm,
it was his stepfather, and he was able to. My brother-in-law was able to spend a lot of time with him, kind of riding the rodeo circuit. That's where farriers do a lot of their work in the summer, is at rodeos. And we had a bit of conversation about it when my brother-in-law was reading the Meadowlark, and I mentioned there's a scene of a rodeo at the end. He had some commentary on one of the drafts. In an early draft, I had this cowboy winning, $300,000 one year, and my brother-in-law was like, "That's impossible. You can never do that. You have to be like one of the best of the best to even get close to that." And I, so I didn't, as you do research, sometimes as a writer, you throw out things, and then you go check it, and you hope that it's true.
yeah.
But sometimes you can find that it's massively, it's very far from the truth, or other times it's, really close to the truth, or you find a truth that's even more interesting and colorful. Um, since that point, so we had a lot of discussion about rodeo. Then he purchased a ranch in central Utah about a year ago.
Mm,
And so one of my thoughts for a sequel to my book is following a character, this rodeo character that is featured in the book.
uh,
I'm still waiting for some of the pieces to come together. I've done a lot of research around this, but yeah, I rode horses as a young man at my grandfather's ranch, and my brother-in-law and I debate whether my grandfather was a rancher or a farmer. There's a whole category of discussion there, right? Because you don't want to call a rancher a farmer, and vice versa. They take exception to that.
mm,
Um, but I'd ridden horses a little bit as a kid. Since then, my brother-in-law bought this ranch. It's a cow-calf operation. It has summer grazing way up in the mountains, and so I've been around it a ton more. I've learned how to ride a horse way differently. With
mm,
how you sit in the saddle and how you turn the horse. I did not know prior to this that you can turn horses with your feet. You have to use your
mm.
feet. That's why cowboys wear spurs. And I got spurs for Christmas, and participated. I got very close to my food source with rebranding the herd that he purchased,
Mm,
vaccinations. We've since worked on calves. I won't go into detail there, but you can only imagine. But all of it, I mean, you don't brand cattle for convenience or fun. You brand them because the state requires you to brand a cow. It's law across the United States
oh,
within like
really?
60 days of purchasing the cattle. And we've all read stories and heard stories of someone who accuses someone of stealing their cattle, right? And a brand is definitive and clear about ownership. So I'm positive that arose out of the West. But there's some of my cowboy
Mm.
experiences, dusty days and fun riding, rounding up cows, bringing them down, doing all kinds of things. It's been
Well, so how often do you get to
fun.
go spend time down there?
Some of it we don't do it on a schedule, but there are certain things you only do certain times of the year.
Okay.
So I have access to it. My wife was doing some work on remodeling the ranch house and a few other things. It was an older home. and is doing another old homestead home on another part of the ranch this summer. So we are down there a fair amount. We have a travel trailer that we took down and just parked it there, and would go down for a couple of days every couple of weeks. And anyway, it's been fun.
Yeah.
Really
Dang,
delightful.
that's cool. That sounds exciting. So this might be related actually, but so most of our listeners are authors and mostly fiction. So I want you to imagine for a second that you were a character in a novel. What is a quirky trait or something that would make you kind of stand out and be memorable as a character?
As a character in a novel. Oh, that's a deep question. One that, I hesitate with an answer because I want to get it right? As a writer, you sort of want to just throw stuff out there, but better still, it sounds good and reads well. And so, as I think about quirky attributes, there are a few funny ones. Like I learned the wolf whistle as a kid, right? And I don't know what
does that mean.
Inspired that, but
how like
whistling with your fingers in your mouth, or with no and a loud whistle. I mean, I can break eardrums almost with my whistle. That I remember riding my bike around town when I was 10, 11, and 12, practicing this. My fingers getting wet from sticking them in my mouth till figuring that out, and then eventually being able to do it without my fingers. And so I throw that out. It's funny because I challenge all my kids and my grandkids now. So if they can learn to wolf whistle, I'll pay them $100. I want them to try it because very few people really can. But I don't know, that's a skill maybe more than a trait. But maybe my trait is that I pay people to try to do weird things. So.
Yeah. Well, dang it. I want to cash in on that. I have a cousin that did that when I was a kid, and my whole life I've just thought it was super cool. So maybe I'll have to.
It's really handy when you're riding a horse and both hands are busy, or when you've got a dog and you're trying to get it back and you're running, and there's just not time to put your fingers in your mouth. And definitely if you whistle Yankee Doodle, it's not loud enough most of the time.
Yeah. So. Dang, that's great. I love it.
That's funny.
Okay, so let's talk about the Meadowlark. And I'm a big fan of titles. I'm curious, when did you know that the Meadowlark was the name of your novel? Like at what point in the writing process?
It was kind of a very early, it was an early development, in part because I just happened to come across this quote from Thomas Jefferson. I was reading Mornings on Horseback. I can't remember, is it Stephen Ambrose that wrote that? Anyway, it was a great book on, not Thomas Jefferson, Teddy Roosevelt. Get my people right here. But Roosevelt had a lot of experience in the East. I had just been to the National Museum of American History in Manhattan, and the exhibits there, the dioramas, a lot of it are kind of inspired by Teddy Roosevelt, who was a mayor of New York, and on, right? So there's a deep kind of Manhattan history and a tug that way. And then he spent time in the Dakotas on a ranch. And I didn't know this, but there's an eastern meadowlark and a western meadowlark. And so this quote reads something like, well, I'll read it. One of our sweetest, loudest songsters is the western meadowlark. This I could hardly get used to at first, for it looks exactly like the eastern meadowlark, which utters nothing but a harsh, disagreeable chatter. Wow. But the air seems to give it a voice, and it will perch on top of a bush or tree and sing for hours in rich, bubbly tones. And if you've heard a western meadowlark, they're amazing, right? It's a like kind of a weird floating sort of song, and the bird song goes on and on. You think, why does a bird say that much? What does it have to say? So when I saw this quote, I really liked the hero's journey. I wanted my character to go through a journey, and while Emma, the modern character, starts in Paris, she's actually living in Manhattan at the time. And I'm not trying to cram too much symbolism in the book, but it's hard not to write that way. We all have sort of symbolic dimensions of our lives, but I wanted to bring her west. She was from the west originally, but came back to the west. So she's one of my meadowlarks. and the others that homesteaded the historical characters kind of take on this Meadowlark journey. They weren't Eastern Meadowlarks to begin with, but they were Meadowlarks nonetheless, who went from kind of harsh, disagreeable chatter to singing in rich, bubbling tones. And so that's when I read that quote, it just hit me as this captures everything I'm imagining to write about. We played with longer versions. I've had people say you should have a descriptive title, and I think you could. There are books with every kind of title out there, right? So I stuck with that one. It seems to have worked so far.
Yeah, no, I really like it, and yeah, I do think the symbolism and there is some poetry to it. So when I started your book, I had it categorized. Well, I should say before I started, as a historical drama, but then as you said, it mixes this modern romance. So I just want to ask you, how do you categorize your book? How do you think about your book? And then how do you pitch your book as far as genre goes, and as far as what people might recognize as, oh, this is the type of thing I'm looking for?
It's confounding at a level, because at one level it's historical fiction. Most people, and I don't know if these are just fans of historical fiction, but if I read my Amazon reviews or other things, people really applaud the historical line of the book, right? It's a dual timeline book with not exactly every other chapter, but a fairly consistent flow of chapters going back and forth between old and modern. That was a device I wanted to use from the beginning, and it was one that really worked to bring the story home and preserve some of the drama in it, because a modern character discovers things about the old line that we haven't read yet, as we're discovering, reading the old line. At a level, it's historical fiction, but yet it's not entirely accurate historical fiction. So I've also people have said, well, those facts are not the facts. And I'm thinking, it's fiction. So, right, how far do you go with making sure that the names and the places and the whatever are actual, but then in your disclaimer you say this is historical fiction and any resemblance to anyone living or dead, right? So I was fairly liberal with that. More direct answer, there's also a romance, and so I don't know if this modern romance is more interesting. A lot of people think the second half of the book really picks up momentum on the modern line and carries it to a place that the payoff is tremendous. The woman who read the audiobook for me coincidentally turns out to have been born in the same area. We didn't even know that about each other until we had agreed to do the book together. So she knew the area well. And as she read it, she's like, I struggled at times with real emotion. I had to stop and then reread sections because it was taking me somewhere. So that's always good to hear, right? As a writer, that you move people. So I kind of think of it as historical romance, if there's a genre that could blend those two. But it's not, when I say historical, it makes people go, oh, I'm going to be reading about the olden days, when that's not entirely accurate with this book. So I kind of will put historical fiction and modern romance in the same listings of genres at times.
Cool. Yeah. I think that actually pegs it pretty well. Let's see. Why did you choose to write about a female protagonist?
That's good. It kind of goes back to why do I call myself BC Walker as a writer? It seems like women are the primary readers today. And by the way, I'm happy with that and really proud of that. My wife reads voraciously. It's fun to see that happen. I love reading, and I'll just confess, I read the classics a lot because I haven't found modern fiction that I really like as a man. So maybe I should step up to that bar and try to write modern fiction that men would read. As a kid, I read Louis L'Amour all the time. But I wasn't stuck in that genre. But there were a lot of books that spoke to kind of who I see myself as and wanted to become, and on and on. And Leon Uris's books, on and on. There are just so many great kind of more modern writers with historical views that were helping me see my way through life. But so the female protagonist has some strong male roles or people, characters in the story, both the historical and the modern. I didn't want to leave those out. So the men who have read it haven't felt like they, had to lay aside their personal desires to read and what they would normally read and read my book as a sort of a service project. They've been really happy with it too.
Yeah, no, and like maybe I should just tell you my take. I felt like it was really heartwarming. But there's also some really hard stuff throughout. But yeah, then it concludes and it's just like, wow, that was heartwarming. That's kind of my personal take. But then, yeah, there's just this theme about how basically the branches have to be connected to the roots in order to thrive. And I just thought that was such a cool theme that, it's about connecting that history and having that connection in order to live and grow. And anyway, yeah, super cool.
Well, your life gets much richer when you can say, oh, I'm related to George Washington, right? Or whoever. You feel something. It makes your world a little bit bigger. And Emma, the protagonist in the modern story, thinks she's got it all figured out until she learns that she doesn't. And then it's a wonderful journey filled with amazing surprises and delightful things to her that just keep opening her world up and kind of blow apart her own personal theories, including what she advocates in her business platform. It's like, well, maybe I need to rethink a little bit of this. But she's richer for the experience of connecting to her past.
Yeah, dang, that's cool. So there's a character who suffers anxiety. There's a lot of kind of harsh deaths. I'll be honest, I cried at one of them when Cassie's kneeling at the graveside. I just thought that was a really profound scene. But I just want to talk, and I'm not quite sure my question, but these are heavy themes. And did you feel, I don't know, did you feel like you needed to treat them a certain way, approach them carefully? And I'm also, I guess, curious at the same time, were they inspired by, I mean, you've mentioned your parents, or your grandfather, I'm sorry. Anyway, were they inspired by real events and real, I guess, hard things that you've been through?
Yeah. The historical line, right? Oftentimes, if you go to a cemetery or you read a brief family history of someone, their own personal history, of someone from the late 1800s or early 1900s, their life is just hard. It's hardship, especially in the world of homesteading and scraping out an existence, subsistence farming, and on and on. But more remarkable, before antibiotics and World War II and vaccinations and other things happened, there's just a high rate of death. And so you visit a cemetery, and it's not uncommon to see, a mother and a father with 4 or 5 other baby headstones nearby or other things. So to me, that is the reality of their life. I read through my own family histories. Most of these stories or the stories that I told in the Meadowlark draw from real family history. I mixed my lines a little bit. I've got cousins who have read the book. They're like, wait, this was the Walker line that did this, not the Rapp line. And I'm like, I just, I kind of threw it together and mixed it. It just served my purpose as well. I also found a great book called Pioneer Irrigation in the Upper Snake River Valley, a book that's out of print, written in the 50s by the Daughters of the Utah Pioneers. Pulled together a ton of great work, and it's sort of this mashup of everything about irrigation, with massive number of anecdotes from the women who lived through these irrigation developments. And so I found some wonderful stories. In the story, in my book, there's a story of Erastus, Simeon, no, it's Erastus, I've got to get it right, climbing across an old ferry line, a cable going across the river in the winter, and scraping ice off as he goes. Well, I drew that from one of my sources, but in that source, it was a young man in the summer who wanted to get across the river to go see his girlfriend. And I thought that was interesting, but when I heard the story, then I pushed it into this other space of
That's
someone
great.
Racing to get a midwife and having no way to get across the river. So, yeah, and the number of deaths, I mean, to your point, I would describe to my wife as I'm writing, and I call it killing off characters. It's not a fun thing to do, but I got attached to these people too. And I'd tell her later that morning on a walk that so and so had passed away, or the three kids did, and I start crying myself. I'm like, well, I'm obviously really feeling this as it's going.
Dang, that's super cool. Well, yeah, let's talk about more of your writing process. So one of my big questions is just, you have a regular career. How do you, I mean, it takes an immense amount of time to write a novel. So how did you find the time to fit this in?
That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, in part we had my first draft was before the pandemic, so I finished it probably in November of 2019. And in the book at the time, I had written about kind of an outbreak of winter fever or whatever, and wasn't familiar with quarantining, but tried to imagine it. And I also, with the Spanish flu, which was in 1918 and 19, went and did some work. So my scene is around Halley's Comet in 1910, and I went back after the pandemic hit, thinking, wow, I should have done the Spanish flu. Did I miss put it in the wrong year? And I looked through that area and death dates and causes, and I found very little mention of anything beyond heart disease in 1918 and 19 among my family line, and even in the area. So I thought, I think we're okay. I mean, it seemed to miss certain parts of the country and hit others hard back then. But then we also learned a lot about pandemics, which indirectly also gave me a lot of time, right, with quarantine. So I wrote the first draft in about 3 months, usually starting about 4:30 in the morning. I'd get up early. It was on my mind. I was excited. It was fun to write. It was just kind of spilling out. Right, I'd write sometimes 3,000 or 4,000 words in a couple of hours, just like banging it out. And
that's impressive.
But banging it out can also be like you're just flipping a paintbrush around on the wall, right? And you get some of it. I typically, in my process, go back the next day and work over what I'd previously written, just to kind of push it further along. And occasionally that meant 2 or 3 days on the same content before writing any new content. But I got to that first draft in about 3 months. It was choppy. The story was there. The twists were there. Everything was there. We had workshopped it heavily. My wife had been instrumental in that, and then continued to help coach me on plot and character development, probably ad nauseum, literally. She's a trooper, but when we were done, it was probably a bigger relief for her than me. She didn't have to hear about it anymore. Or read she probably read it 5 or 10 times along the way. Then the editing process. So during the pandemic, it was not hard to find a little extra time because there was a lot of it. We're empty nesters. We didn't have our pod quickly formed of all of our kids gathering around, so we were on our own. And I continued that writing routine through much of that with an editor working on it. Adding elements, taking the historical line apart and the modern line apart and looking at those as independent timelines to make sure that they flowed. In this case, the historical line was very easy to lose track of the timeline. And so I have a spreadsheet that I built where I could automatically calculate on any given year what someone's age would be. And even then I'd get it wrong because I would have to go, well, that was before their birthday, so they would have been, right. And I needed to probably do it by month almost. There were times when I'd go back to a draft, like 6 drafts in, and find that someone was the wrong age the whole time, and so it was just a lot of little things like that. The fact checking was fun, but also a little bit tortuous at times. So when I got done with it, I parked it for probably a year and then did another real deep read. I went out for publication to publishers. The pandemic really worked that whole industry over. We had some solid looks, but just really spent a lot of time with the book sitting. And so subsequently decided that I wanted, my birthday was last November, and I wanted to get it done by my birthday and move it along, right, and move on to what might be next. So wrapped it up, finished it, and it's been fun.
Yeah, dang, cool. Did you know in the beginning how it was going to end? Or when you were just pounding out those long days, did you kind of discover it as you went?
I knew from the beginning, in part. We came back after visiting graves in Idaho Memorial Day, or that weekend, and then on Memorial Day itself, no, it would have been Sunday. Memorial Day is always on a Monday.
Mm.
We went to the Provo Cemetery nearby, where my wife, her father, is buried. He passed when she was 8, and so we've
Oh, wow.
always gone there. And as we walked around, I was looking kind of for something to bring the story together. We ran across this big wall of plaques commemorating people from the Utah State Mental Hospital that had been buried there, but not in marked graves or named graves. And so this honored them, and I thought, I wonder how we could tie that in. It started feeling right. And then I subsequently found that there had been something very similar in Blackfoot, Idaho, near where my story is set, with actually even more people. And prior to this, I had no idea that there was a mental hospital in Blackfoot, Idaho. And so I did a little more research on that. But that helped bring the story together with a character that I added. And then the final scene was very clear. I had to add a little more time to air the story out, to let it kind of move through time and allow for some research to happen inside the story. And then, so I finished it with version A, and then subsequent to that, I had a realization as I was working over the draft and got to the very end of the book and realized that there was another character that I needed to resolve that I hadn't yet. And that felt like that really was bringing the story completely around and finished it. So yes, I knew, but then there was still some tidying up to do.
Yeah.
That fell into the same scene, right? It just happened to be a richer version of it.
Man, I just have to say, it is so fun hearing you talk about this after having just read it, because I can see where these pieces came from. Anyway, it's just a lot of fun. Let's see. So I don't know if you've read The War of Art, but Stephen Pressfield talks about resistance and how there's just kind of this thing that's trying to keep you from doing your creative work. And so I'll tell people I'm an author, and 80 or 90% of them, their response is, I hate writing. And then the other 10 or 20%, they say, oh, I've always wanted to write a novel. But I find that a lot of those people don't end up writing a novel. So how did you get past the resistance, and how did you finally okay, I'm going to make this happen?
That's a great question, because, I probably spent hundreds of hours thinking about writing a novel and even talking about it. Again, my wife, who happens to be both the best listener in the world and probably too much of a pincushion for my thoughts, would probably say that, again, she had heard about it a lot. And she never said, well, if you're, stop talking about it, just do it, or if you're not going to do it, at least stop talking about it. And she didn't say that, but something just had brought me to the point where it was probably, it was like background music in my mind for a couple of decades. And I would toy with an idea here or an idea there. But so I never sat down and did the snowflake method or did the whatever, right, on the kernel of a story, and then just building out from there. And I suppose, and I felt like this as I wrote, that you kind of can put two people together or a person in a situation, and the story will start falling out from that. In the Meadowlark, I was very careful to set every conversation in a scene. I wanted it to feel rich. I wanted to be very visual in terms of mental imagery as you would read, and be able to go, wow, I imagine that. Oh, I can smell that. I can write, and not just have someone sitting on a chair too much. There's a little bit of that, but not a lot. Right? Their office location overlooks the Hudson. Right there's stuff that you can see and do. But I think to your point, there are a lot of people who say writing is just painful, and I can't. Writing words onto a page is the most painful thing I can think of. I don't have that issue, but I think that I can't tell you what brought it about, because I keep waiting for it to fully happen with a second book that I'm 90 pages into, and I've parked it now, going, all right, I think is that writer's block? I don't know. I don't have a deadline. All right, I'm just waiting for some inspiration to weave the story further. And I guess if I had to subsist solely on the output of my writing, then I'd think differently. But for me, it's obviously a bit more of a hobby. But it's a colorful one, right? It's very interesting to me.
So if someone said, oh, I've been working on a novel, or I've wanted to write a novel, I just can't get started. Or if they said, I've started many drafts, but I can never finish it. Do you have any tips, like any insights on it? Like, how do you finish? Anything you'd say to them?
I do really like, again, the hero's journey, but it's less, obviously it's very granular at one level, but in a way it's just beginning, middle, and end, right? It's the hero, or the story, I would say, started at the last minute possible, right? Have something that's about to happen that takes the character, the protagonist, out of their comfort zone, out of the normal world. And it doesn't have to be that they're immediately launched into the mystical, magical world. It just means that their normal is breaking apart. They're facing a crisis of some kind. Something's driving them. And we've all read stories or watched TV shows or movies where you're like, if you can get through the first 3 chapters of the first 30 minutes, it gets interesting. To me, my only criticism there is that those don't start at the last minute possible.
Yeah.
And then there are others where the minute the story starts, it's a chase scene that lasts, through the whole movie, and you're on the edge of your seat, and you don't even know what the movie's called till the very end, right? But you're interested. So the beginning needs to be, you have to have me as a reader be willing to leave my normal world in order to go into your magical world, right? So get me there quickly. The magical world, the disruption, what's it going to be like, I don't know how long that takes, because it's not always, in my own experience, not just as a writer, but also as a consumer of entertainment and media. I think I love that part of the story. I love being introduced to something different. So bring different to me, and it's okay if it takes a while for me to get it all. But then the end needs to, I'm a huge fan of payoff in my personal narrative work. It's like that last line, right? It has to be, and in a book, it has to be the last chapter or something close to it that just brings you as a character to a point of going, it's like you just feel like you got to the end of something glorious and beautiful, and not just have it kind of peter out and go, yeah, it's over. I watch it seems like modern streaming content has this, especially series, sort of just drop you at the end of something that it's not really the end. It's like, they're kind of like, I just gave you a hug. Okay, credits come up, and you're going, I don't feel a resolution from that. I like beginning, middle, and end, even if it's a serialized show. Wrap it up, move me on. I'm okay with some through lines, but don't have everything be a through line.
Yeah.
So that's my rough advice.
Yeah. Okay. So you mentioned your personal essays. Is that something you could send me a link for, and I could include in the show notes so people could read those?
I'll send those. Yeah. They're actually on my website, bcwalker.com. They're featured there.
Okay. So, yeah. Awesome.
And I can send you the specific links if that would be helpful.
Yeah. That would be awesome. Let's see. So it sounds like you organized your thoughts through a spreadsheet, or at least your timelines. Did you have any other ways of organizing your story? Yeah. Actually, I should add in here, I know that you're a visual artist, so maybe you painted or like fleshed out scenes somehow. Anyway, tell us more.
Yeah, no, I didn't do any of that for this. I mean, I do a lot of photography and I do some art, fine art, and in that, I often am featuring kind of farm scenes. So this kind of more rural
Mm.
setting is appealing to me visually. I used OneNote quite a bit as my catch-all for my research. So it was great to be able to chunk things into folders and save stuff out. Right. I had lots of questions about horses and horse tethers and how they would, would
Mm.
you hook a horse to a wagon or would you hook an ox to a wagon? If you hooked a horse to a wagon, would it have blinders on? Right. All those details that you kind of got to sort
Dang.
through. And in an earlier draft of the Meadowlark, I had one scene where Erastus, excuse me, Simeon pushes his foot onto the horse that is pulling his wagon to kind of coax it, and the horse looks back at him with a kind of foaming mouth and this angry, crazy eye. And then as I was around this a little bit more, I realized that you don't do that with horses. You put blinders on them for all the right reasons, and
Mm.
I had to take that out. I loved that little detail when I drafted it, but it wasn't. At one point, I'm like, it's more important to be accurate because I don't want someone who knows things about horses to go, yeah, no, that would never happen. Horses can't even stand side by side for very long without nipping at each other. But you put blinders on, and they don't see anything but ahead.
Huh.
Um, so OneNote became my place, and I would do outlines there. I do character development there. I'd be able to jump around quickly to see, keep references of who I was tracking and how, and then as I developed chapters needing detail, I could go there for my research.
Hmm. Awesome. So we're getting a little short on time. I'm going to ask you some rapid fire questions. I imagine they'll just be kind of short answers, but this one I was out of personal curiosity. There's a character who gets saran wrapped in your story. Is that from something real, or how did you come up with that idea?
That's good. In the early drafts, Emma, the character, was kind of too snarky for people,
Mm.
for some reason I thought she was cheeky and fun sounding, but it came across as sort of snarky and mean. And so in part, I explored why would she be that way, and in parallel, I also softened her character a lot and made her a lot more
Mm.
accessible. But interestingly, my wife had something similar to that happen, probably not at the same
Uh,
degree of aggression, with duct tape. Um, and so when she was in high school, so kind of was something I
ah,
explored with her that felt like it would be psychologically profound for
yeah.
a woman in particular. I'm not a big fan of aggression. I don't like going to some of the places that I went close to in this book, but that was where that came from.
Yeah. Cool. So Tanya Rawlingson narrated your book. How did you find such a great narrator?
Yeah, she did a good job. ACX, the Amazon Creative Exchange. I went there. You can audition voices. You can make offers to people, including a royalty-free or royalty split offer, or you can say, I'll give you royalty share plus some cash,
Mm-hmm.
or pay you outright to be done with it. Because it was my first book and self-published, I went with an offer. You put up a sample of your book. I had probably 12 auditions. None of them really spoke to us. When we heard her voice, it was like, okay, she's the
Uh,
one. Just
dang.
really amazing. She accepted the offer, and as I said, subsequently found out that she was born right in the heart of where my book
That's
is set.
so cool.
Knew the area. There are there's a childhood song in the book that she commented and said, "Would you like that song sung or read?" And I said, "If you know the tune, sing it." And she goes, "Okay, I already did." Right. So she was just clipping along, very familiar with so much of the context of the book.
Huh.
So
Dang, that's cool. How have your family members responded to you becoming a published author?
I think they mostly, if there was going back to your trait question, I'm very not scattered. I just have a lot of interests. I mean, I have too many
Hmm.
interests and too much time, too little time to do them all. So none of this surprised my family. I think that they'd seen me publish a few things before. They were kind of glad to have it done. Many of them were, read drafts and helped and brainstormed with me on things. Um, but I think that they're all proud. They've all read it and like it. One of them said, okay, so as I read it, I really could read our family history, not just the historical version, but even the recent version. There are scenes in there where Emma's dad has taken her all over Utah on side trips and on, and and she drove 100 miles an hour in the car as a teenager, right, with him inside. And so a lot of that is from our family background. So it was interesting to hear my kids go, okay, you've captured our life. And I thought, that wasn't my intent, but there it is.
Dang, that's great. What's your favorite game, either to play or to watch?
Oh, I'm a big fan of Spike Ball right now. I like that. It's fun. It's mentally challenging. You don't have to run all over the place. I'm a big fan of soccer. And then when it comes to like table games, card games, I like Five Crowns. Just a fun little quick-paced game that involves a lot of luck and a little bit of strategy.
Cool. What does work-life balance mean to you?
That's a great question. Early in my career, I did a degree in organizational behavior, so that's kind of the touchy-feely side of business. I imagine someday being able to have more weekend, less work time, more time to play, more time to ski, golf, hike, run, right? All the stuff that I love. And so I came up with this idea that the best work-life balance for me would be a 5.5-day weekend, or a 6.5-day weekend, excuse me, right? A half day a week of work.
That's great.
It's hard to pull that off when, with a corporate job or things that require that kind of attention. But for me, I've tried really hard to be available from family events across my career, probably sometimes sacrificing my career a little bit, but it's been my priority to look at work as a reason to make money and to provide and find meaning in other things too.
What book are you going to read tonight?
I'm reading To Kill a Mockingbird right now. At a level, you could argue it's not a very woke book at all, and yet at the same time, it's got an important role. So I haven't read it since high school, and thought so I'm partway into that. I'll read it again.
Dang, cool.
My nights are often more Sudoku nights, just something to wind down. So
yeah, cool. Who's an author who you look up to?
And not everyone likes this answer, but I love Hemingway.
Cool.
And his personal life was a mess. There was a time when his personal life wasn't so messy. But across his writing, in part, he wrote kind of semi-autobiographically. He was experiencing a lot of what he was writing about. I write from that place. I love his brief, sometimes terse dialogue, and even sometimes how he doesn't attribute the words to any particular character. You're left to sort that out for yourself.
Yeah.
And it doesn't go all the way E.E. Cummings, but it kind of goes to this place of words pattern on a page, and he makes sense of it. But his access to kind of dialogue as an expression of inner thought is pretty remarkable. Descriptively, he leaves a lot to be desired, but that's kind of who I look up to as a writer.
Yeah, dang, that's awesome. Okay, well, it's been a pleasure chatting with you. I'm grateful to have had you as a guest. I'll give you the final words. You can ask something of our listeners. You can give advice. You can answer a question that I should have asked but didn't ask you. But any parting words you'd like to say?
Wow. I'll go to Hemingway on this. I think he would write a half day and read the other half day, right? He was always replenishing his library of content. So live, right? Living a life it gives us the greatest access to, in my opinion, meaningful content. Research and other things simply clarify and make us more accurate, but without experience, we have nothing to write about, in my opinion.
Dang, that's awesome. Well, thank you so much. I loved your book. I'm glad we could talk. And to our listeners, it's time to start writing. So there you have it.
That was our interview. I hope you enjoyed it. You've heard me, this is a weird quirk that I have, but I tend to start writing novels with the title. And this title popped into my head, Stealing Indiana Jones. And I was going to write about, this is where the people who made Indiana Jones got their ideas from. And then I kind of wanted to expand that into, this is how artists come up with their ideas. So this is going to be a story about inspiration. And as I started drafting this, finally, I'd been thinking about it for years, but I finally started drafting it. And as I was drafting, it started to be a story about my brother who passed away. And this essay started to also be the story of us. It's kind of light and fun, and it's about being a kid in the 90s. And it's also kind of this heavy manuscript about dealing with the death of someone who's really close to you. So right now I'm just going to play you, which is what is essentially the back cover blurb from Stealing Indiana Jones.
In 1990, a 6-year-old boy stole something from his neighbors. A small book. The ultimate Indiana Jones treasure. A Grail diary. It promised everlasting life, but because it was stolen, the little boy didn't dare tell his older brother, his mentor, what he'd done. In 2020, 30 years later, that older brother passed away. Stealing Indiana Jones is the true story of these two boys and how they discover a monstrous secret, that George Lucas stole his ideas for both Star Wars and Indiana Jones. As they struggle to make sense of what this horrifying truth means for all of us fans, they find redemption along the way. Their story explores inspiration and how great stories come to life. It examines, without shying away, disillusionment and innocence doomed to die. Their story is a salute to the loss of childhood and to the loss of life. Stealing Indiana Jones is a journey through the 90s, a glimpse of boyhood and fandom, and it's filled with both heartbreak and heroism. Most importantly, it's a quest to uncover the secret behind all great stories, the secret of immortality.
I am very proud of this. It's a short piece. It's available on Audible now, and I got to narrate it, and that was a lot of fun. If you're interested in reading it, you can find it on Amazon, or anybody who signs up for my newsletter, I send them a free copy of this ebook. And you can do that at theinformant.jwashburn.com, or just look down in the show notes of this podcast and you'll see a link to it.